It's comforting to believe that monsters are born different from us, that evil has a face we could recognize, a warning sign we'd never miss. But what if evil doesn't arrive in the form of a monster at all? What if it comes wearing an apron, smiling politely, speaking softly to his neighbors? This is not just the story of a murderer. It's the story of how a normal life can slowly, quietly, transform into something unrecognizable. And how, even in the shadow of such horror, truth and justice still find their way to the light. July 22nd, 1944. As Soviet soldiers advanced through eastern Poland, they expected another battle, gunfire, smoke, resistance. Instead, they stepped into a silence no war had ever prepared them for. Inside the barbed wire fences of Majdanek, they found piles of shoes belonging to children, mountains of human hair, and furnaces still warm with ash. The air itself carried the smell of death. Hardened men, who had survived years of combat, broke down and wept. Some vomited. Others simply stared, unable to understand what they were seeing. They had just become the first Allied soldiers to uncover a Nazi concentration camp still intact, still echoing with the voices of those who never walked out. The world would later learn what they discovered that day, that genocide wasn't chaos, it was a system, designed, built, and perfected by men who once held ordinary jobs, had families, and believed they were just doing their duty. Among those men was Erich Muhsfeldt, the chief executioner of Majdanek. Before the war, he baked bread for a living. By its end, he was feeding bodies to the same ovens where he once baked loaves. To the prisoners who survived, he wasn't just a murderer, he was the embodiment of cruelty made ordinary. In this episode, we'll uncover the path that led him from a quiet town in Germany to the gates of hell. We'll see how an entire generation was taught to replace empathy with obedience, how systems of power rewarded cruelty, and how a man who might have lived a simple life became a willing tool of annihilation. We'll also witness the reckoning that followed the moment when history finally turned its gaze back at him and demanded answers no one could justify. Because to understand men like Erich Muhsfeldt is to understand the machinery of evil itself, and, perhaps, how to recognize it when it begins again. Before the screams, before the smoke, there was only the smell of freshly baked bread, the warmth of a small kitchen in northern Germany. A young man named Erich, wiping flour from his hands, dreaming of opening his own bakery someday. He was, by all accounts, gentle, quiet, ordinary, but in 1933, something changed, the world around him began to twist. A new voice rose over the radio, promising greatness to the nation and purpose to the forgotten. And slowly, almost invisibly, the baker began to disappear, replaced by someone else entirely. Let's go back to where it all began, to the day when the smell of bread first mixed with the scent of smoke. Before the world knew him as a war criminal, Erich Muhsfeldt was simply a baker. He was born in 1913, in a small German town that smelled of rain and rye bread. His father worked as a carpenter, his mother stayed at home, and Erich spent his childhood surrounded by fields and quiet streets. He wasn't remarkable. He wasn't ambitious. He was just ordinary. At 17, he finished an apprenticeship at a local bakery. He was known for his patience, the kind of man who could wait for dough to rise without complaint. He married young, had a son, and spent his mornings kneading bread before the sun climbed over the rooftops. If you had met him then, you might have trusted him. You might have even liked him. But 1933 was not an ordinary year. When Adolf Hitler came to power, Germany was a country on its knees, humiliated by war, crushed by debt, hungry for hope. People wanted order, certainty, someone to tell them who was to blame. And the new regime offered exactly that. The baker from Neuruppin found himself listening to the radio speeches like everyone else, at first out of curiosity, then out of conviction. He joined the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts. In the same year, Hitler became chancellor. To him, it was not an act of hate. It was an act of belonging. The uniform gave him something the bakery never could, a sense of purpose. Marching in formation, hearing his boots echo on cobblestones, he no longer felt small. In those moments, he was part of something larger than himself. And that's how it began, not with violence, but with pride. By 1937, Erich transferred to the SS, the elite corps of Hitler's state. He learned discipline, obedience, and the idea that mercy was weakness. The bakery apron became a black uniform. The smell of flour was replaced by the scent of polished leather and smoke. Somewhere along the way, the man who once shaped bread began shaping death. It's easy now to wonder how he could have changed so completely. But history rarely transforms people overnight. It seduces them one small step at a time. A little compromise here, a small silence there, until one morning they wake up and realize they've crossed a line they can't return from. Across Germany, thousands of ordinary men followed the same path. Farmers became guards. Teachers became informants. Railway clerks scheduled trains to Auschwitz with the same precision they once used to plan commuter routes. They didn't see themselves as murderers, only as workers, following orders, keeping their jobs. That was the genius of the system. It made evil look like duty. Erich Muhsfeldt wasn't born cruel. He was taught to obey, to value loyalty over compassion, and to fear standing alone. And that's how ordinary people become instruments of extraordinary horror, not because they love violence, but because they stop questioning it. A small lesson hides here. Evil doesn't always announce itself with shouting and flags. Sometimes it comes quietly disguised as safety, routine, and obedience. And the people who commit it are rarely the ones who think they ever could. By 1939, Erich had joined the Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units of the SS, men tasked not with fighting on battlefields, but with running camps. He was no longer a baker. He was a cog in something vast, efficient, and merciless. The kind of machine that could turn ideology into industry and human lives into numbers. The war had begun, and so had his true transformation. The ovens that once baked bread would soon burn something else entirely. But to understand how the machinery of death was built, and how it turned men like Erich Muhsfeldt into executioners of unimaginable scale, we must step inside the system that made it possible. Because in the next chapter, we'll see that the Holocaust wasn't the madness of a few, it was the organization of many. By the time Europe was sliding toward war, Erich Muhsfeldt had already found his place in a new kind of army, one that didn't fight for territory, but for ideology. He wore the skull insignia of the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units. To outsiders, their name might have sounded symbolic, but inside their world, it was a promise and a warning. These men weren't soldiers in the usual sense. They didn't storm beaches or man the front lines. Their duty was quieter, more methodical. They were the architects and operators of what the Nazis called the final solution. It was their job to build, guard, and perfect the machinery of organized death. For newcomers like Muhsfeldt, the SS training program was both terrifying and seductive. Recruits were taught that compassion was treason, that mercy weakened the state. They marched in freezing rain for hours, punished for showing exhaustion. They were told that Jews, Poles, Roma, anyone deemed subhuman, were not people at all, but problems to be solved. And each time they obeyed without question, each time they ignored their conscience, something inside them grew quieter. Obedience became easier, indifference became habit, and cruelty, eventually, became normal. At first, Muhsfeldt's job seemed administrative. He supervised labor groups, counted prisoners, kept records. To him, it felt almost bureaucratic, a strange echo of his old life as a baker, where every loaf had to be weighed, counted, and recorded. Only now, the numbers represented lives, and the efficiency that once made him a good worker made him a deadly one. The SS had built something unprecedented, an entire system where murder was broken into small, manageable tasks. One man guarded the gate. Another handled transportation. A third managed inventory, clothes, hair, teeth, gold. Each believed he was simply doing his part. No one had to see the full picture to keep it working. That was the genius of the machine. It didn't need monsters, just obedient men. In the archives that survived the war, historians later found documents stamped with precision. Arrival, 1,200 prisoners. Labor, 640. Deceased, 560. No emotion, no names. Just numbers typed on paper, signed by men like Muhsfeldt. If you read those reports, you wouldn't see screams, or smoke, or pain. You'd see the quiet language of efficiency, the same language corporations use to track shipments. the same language governments use to manage populations. And that's what makes it so chilling. During this period, Muhsfeldt began to rise through the ranks. He was efficient, reliable, unquestioning, qualities any employer might praise, except his employer was the SS. He didn't kill because he enjoyed it. He killed because it was expected. Because in a system where obedience was virtue, questioning became the greatest sin. Some guards, the rare few, broke down or tried to transfer out. Others convinced themselves the prisoners deserved it. But for most like Muhsfeldt, it was easier not to think about it at all. It was easier to focus on the paperwork, the routine, the ritual of salutes and roll calls. The machine thrived on that silence. And here lies the quiet danger. Evil doesn't always need hatred to survive. Sometimes it only needs order. It hides behind routines, meetings, titles, uniforms, and once it's disguised as duty, it can spread faster than anyone realizes. The men who built that machinery weren't lunatics or sadists. They were, in many ways, ordinary workers doing extraordinary harm. And Erich Muhsfeldt was one of its most efficient cogs. By 1940, the system was fully operational. The SS had designed camps across occupied Poland, each with its own purpose. Auschwitz for labor and extermination, Treblinka for annihilation, Majdanek for both. The trains ran on time. The records were flawless. It was bureaucracy weaponized against life itself. When Muhsfeldt was assigned to Auschwitz later that year, it was considered a promotion. He would finally see the machine he had helped build, not on paper, but in motion. There, he would learn to turn obedience into efficiency, and efficiency into death. In the next chapter, we'll step inside that place, not to sensationalize, but to understand how men like Muhsfeldt perfected the art of dehumanization. Because in Auschwitz, evil was not improvised. It was organized, and Erich Muhsfeldt would become one of its most devoted students. When Erich Muhsfeldt first stepped through the gates of Auschwitz in August 1940, he entered a world built to erase everything human, including the humanity of those who worked there. The camp stretched endlessly across the Polish countryside, rows of barbed wire, watchtowers, chimneys breathing black smoke into grey skies. Even for the guards, the air felt heavy, poisoned by something unseen. Auschwitz was not chaos. It was order. Every movement, every breath of life and death was part of a system. Prisoners marched in lines, ate at set hours, slept on command, died on schedule. And Muhsfeldt, meticulous, disciplined, obedient, fit perfectly into that rhythm. At first, his duties seemed technical. He was placed in charge of prisoner work details, organizing who went to the factories, who stayed in the quarry, who was unfit to labor. It was a job that required no emotion, only efficiency. He kept records, counted heads. He didn't swing the whip often, he didn't need to. His authority came from silence, not rage. But every choice he made carried invisible consequences. Every mark on his clipboard meant a body sent closer to death. And each day, he learned that looking away was easier than looking back. That's how it happens, not in a moment of madness, but in a slow surrender of conscience. In Auschwitz, brutality was currency. The more ruthless a guard appeared, the faster he rose. Kindness was punished. Doubt was weakness. And so Muhsfeldt adapted. He learned to deliver orders without blinking, to watch men collapse without intervening. He became fluent in the language of cruelty not because he loved it, but because it became the only language spoken. Survivors would later describe guards like him as machine men, moving with mechanical precision, unfeeling, expressionless. But the truth is more complicated. They were not machines. They were men who had learned how to turn off the part of themselves that could feel. In one report, Muhsfeldt was praised for efficiency in managing prisoner work operations. To his superiors, that meant fewer delays, cleaner numbers, smoother processes. But to the prisoners, it meant something else entirely, more suffering, less chance to live another day. He wasn't yet the sadistic figure he would later become at Majdanek. At Auschwitz, he was still learning how a camp runs, how death can be measured like production output, how to obey without thought. He was, as one historian later put it, the perfect student of the Nazi system. There's something haunting about that phrase, perfect student. It reminds us that systems like these don't only rely on leaders or ideologues. They rely on followers. They rely on people who do their jobs well, who take pride in efficiency, who never stop to ask why. When you look at Muhsfeldt's early reports, you don't see a murderer's handwriting. You see a clerk's precision, straight lines, neat margins, every signature perfectly aligned. It's the handwriting of a man who wanted to be good at his work. And that's what makes it so terrifying. The lesson is simple, but deeply human. The most dangerous kind of evil isn't born from hatred. It's born from obedience, from the desire to belong, to succeed, to be seen as reliable in a world that rewards conformity. Most of us like to believe we'd resist, that we'd speak up, walk away, refuse the order. But history whispers otherwise. It tells us that evil often doesn't need our enthusiasm, only our silence. By 1941, Muhsfeldt had become so adept at his duties that his superiors decided to transfer him to a new camp being expanded in eastern Poland. Its name was Majdanek, an experimental facility meant to combine forced labor with mass extermination. There, he would no longer just count prisoners. He would oversee their deaths. For the Nazi hierarchy, it was a promotion. For Erich Muhsfeldt, it was the final step of his transformation from the quiet baker of Neuruppin to the overseer of one of humanity's darkest chapters. The smoke of Auschwitz would soon be replaced by something even worse: silence. Because in Majdanek, death no longer needed to be hidden behind fences or secrecy. It was open, constant, industrial, and in the next chapter, we will enter that place, the day when the earth itself seemed to scream. By late 1943, the war was beginning to turn against Germany. The Red Army was advancing from the east. Allied bombers filled the western skies, and whispers of Jewish uprisings spread across the occupied territories. At camps like Sobibor and Treblinka, prisoners had done the unthinkable: they had rebelled. To Himmler, this was intolerable. He wanted a message of absolute control, a warning written in blood. That message would be sent from Majdanek. In late October, Erich Muhsfeldt received new orders. Prisoners, mostly Jewish men, women and children, were told to dig long trenches near the camp's perimeter. Each trench stretched hundreds of feet, deep and wide, as if meant for aircraft defense. At least, that's what the guards told them. Some believed it. Others, especially those who had seen too much, already knew what was coming. The wind turned cold that week. Autumn leaves swirled across the barbed wire as the digging continued. A strange stillness settled over the camp, the kind that only comes before something terrible. On November 3rd, 1943, the killing began. From dawn until dusk, machine guns rattled without pause. The SS called it Operation Harvest Festival. They said it was meant to cleanse the Lublin district of Jews. In reality, it became the single largest massacre of the Holocaust, carried out in a single operation. Over 43,000 people murdered in 2 days. Loudspeakers around the camp blared cheerful marches, Wagner, Beethoven, even folk songs to drown out the gunfire and the screams. Prisoners were ordered to undress, to hand over their clothes, their shoes, their glasses, their last possessions. Then they were lined up in groups of 50, marched toward the trenches they themselves had dug. Inside, the earth was already slick with blood. Guards lined the edges, rifles ready. Among them stood Erich Muhsfeldt. Witnesses would later testify that he moved like a man possessed, barking orders, checking ammunition, pacing the perimeter as if conducting a grim symphony. When the guns began, he didn't flinch. The killing lasted for hours. The air filled with dust and gunpowder. The ground trembled under the weight of falling bodies. When ammunition ran low, soldiers paused only long enough to reload, then the shooting resumed. By evening, the trenches were overflowing. Some prisoners were still breathing when the next wave arrived. They were shot where they lay. By nightfall, the camp was silent again, except for the faint hum of the generators and the music still playing from the loudspeakers. One survivor, hidden beneath a pile of bodies, later recalled hearing a guard say, "Even the earth is full. There's no more room for them." For 2 full days, the killing continued not only at Majdanek, but also at Trawnicki and Poniatowa camps nearby. The Nazis called it harvest. But what they harvested was life itself. By the end of November 4th, more than 43,000 people were dead. The trenches were covered with thin layers of dirt, though the ground kept shifting for days as if the earth itself was breathing, refusing to hold so much death. That's why survivors later said, "On those days the earth screamed." For Muhsfeldt, the massacre marked a turning point. Something inside him, whatever small remnant of conscience remained, was gone. From that point forward, cruelty became his craft. He was promoted, praised, and given more authority. To the SS, he was efficient, reliable, loyal. To the prisoners, he was a ghost, the face of an evil that never looked tired, never looked sorry. Historians often struggle to describe events like these. Statistics can't capture the sound of 43,000 voices silenced. Photographs can't show the smell of gunpowder and soil. Even survivor testimonies, powerful as they are, can only touch the edges of what happened. Because there are moments in history so vast, so unbearable, that language itself seems to collapse under their weight. And yet, those moments matter most because they remind us how easily order can turn into extermination, and how quickly human beings can learn to live beside horror. The lesson of Operation Harvest Festival is simple, but eternal. When a society decides that some people are less than human, it can justify anything. It can dig trenches and call them defense ditches. It can shoot families and call it order. It can murder thousands and call it harvest. And the ones who carry out those acts, people like Muhsfeldt, rarely see themselves as villains. They see themselves as professionals. After the massacre, Majdanek's soil turned black from ash and rain. The trenches were covered, the music stopped, and the SS returned to their routines. To the outside world, it was just another day of war. But for those who survived, time itself changed. They said the camp was never quiet again, that at night, the ground seemed to whisper the names of the dead. When the operation ended, Muhsfeldt didn't rest. He had proven himself to his superiors, and they rewarded him with more power control over the crematoriums themselves. It was no longer enough to kill. Now, he would oversee the destruction of every trace that those people had ever existed. And so begins the next chapter. Inside the furnaces of Majdanek, where smoke replaced faces, and where the man once called a baker finally completed his transformation into something far worse than a murderer. After Operation Harvest Festival, Majdanek changed. The smell of gunpowder faded, but a new stench took its place, the smell of burning flesh. The trenches were sealed, the guns silenced, yet the killing continued, this time not in the open fields, but behind the concrete walls of the crematorium. And standing at the center of it all was Erich Muhsfeldt. He was now in charge of crematorium operations, the cold, mechanical heart of the camp. Every day, he oversaw the arrival of bodies from the gas chambers, the loading of corpses onto metal trolleys, and the constant feeding of flames that devoured human remains. The ovens never rested. They roared like living creatures, consuming hundreds every day. To his superiors, Muhsfeldt was the model officer, efficient, precise, emotionally detached. To the prisoners forced to work under him, he was something else entirely, a man who seemed to take pleasure in destruction. Survivor testimonies paint a portrait not of sudden madness, but of ritualized cruelty. They say he would walk through the crematorium humming softly, sometimes a lullaby, sometimes a military march. He carried a polished leather whip, not for control, but for comfort, as if holding it reminded him of his power. He would stop beside the ovens, stare into the flames, and whisper things no one wanted to hear. One prisoner recalled how Muhsfeldt would choose people at random, whispering, "You're next," not to threaten but to enjoy their fear. Another remembered him laughing after striking a man so hard his teeth shattered. He wasn't angry, the witness said. He was entertained. But the most haunting stories come from the Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners forced to work inside the crematorium. They said Muhsfeldt sometimes ordered executions inside the furnaces themselves. One young woman, realizing she had been selected for gassing, begged for mercy. When she tried to scratch his face in desperation, he smiled and said quietly, "You'll burn alive for that." And she did. It wasn't rage. It was something far colder, a man completely at peace with his own inhumanity. Historians would later debate what drove such behavior. Was it ideology, habit, sadism? The truth may lie somewhere in between. For Muhsfeldt, violence had become routine. Every command followed without question. every death processed without emotion. And once empathy dies, cruelty becomes effortless. He was no longer the baker, or even the soldier. He was the caretaker of oblivion. His job was not only to kill, but to erase, to make sure no trace of the victims remained. Among the few surviving medical staff was Dr. Miklos Nyszly, a Hungarian Jewish physician forced to serve under SS doctors at Auschwitz and later witness operations at Majdanek. He recalled men like Muhsfeldt as perfectly polite devils. They would discuss the day's work over coffee, then return to oversee executions as if continuing an ordinary task. In one account, Nyszly described an incident that captures the essence of this horror. A young girl, perhaps 16, survived a gassing. When she was discovered still breathing, Nyszly pleaded for a chance to save her life. Muhsfeldt refused. He pulled out his pistol and shot her in the back of the head. Then he turned to Nyszly and said, "Now your count is correct." That sentence, "Now your count is correct," says everything about how far he'd fallen. The value of a life had become nothing more than a number on a list. Yet even in that darkness, small flickers of humanity appeared not from Muhsfeldt, but from the prisoners he tried to destroy. Some would whisper prayers while cleaning the ovens. Others risked their lives to smuggle notes, photographs, or scraps of names into hidden corners, hoping someone, someday, would remember them. In a place built to erase identity, they fought to leave behind proof that they existed. And that, in the end, may be what separated them from men like Muhsfeldt. They still believed life had meaning even when surrounded by death. A lesson remains here, heavy but necessary. Cruelty doesn't always wear rage on its face. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it hums a song. And sometimes it does its job so quietly that others mistake it for normal. The Holocaust teaches us that evil does not always scream. More often it whispers, and the world turns its head away. By mid-1944, as the Soviet army moved westward, Majdanek was on the brink of collapse. The SS began destroying evidence, dismantling gas chambers, burning documents, filling in mass graves. Muhsfeldt was transferred once again, this time back to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the killing of Hungarian Jews had reached an industrial scale. There, he would continue his grim expertise not as a soldier defending his nation, but as a man desperately clinging to a system built on lies. The empire he served was crumbling, and soon its monsters would have nowhere left to hide. Because when the Reich began to fall, the camps began to move, and so did the men who ran them. For Muhsfeldt, the fire that once symbolized control was about to consume everything he believed in. And in the next chapter, we'll follow that descent, from the burning chimneys of Auschwitz to the collapsing front lines of a dying empire. By the summer of 1944, the empire that once promised 1,000 years was crumbling in less than 12. From the east, the Red Army advanced like a tide that would not retreat. From the west, American and British bombers darkened the skies over Germany's cities. And deep inside occupied Poland, the once proud machinery of death began to break apart, not out of mercy, but out of fear. At Majdanek, smoke still rose from the crematorium, but the guards were packing up files, dismantling gas chambers, and burying evidence. Orders came from Berlin: destroy everything, leave nothing for the enemy to find. But the Soviets were too fast. By July 22, 1944, they reached Lublin, and what they found shocked even battle-hardened soldiers. They walked through gates still warm with ashes, through barracks filled with shoes, hair, and bones. Majdanek became the first concentration camp liberated by Allied forces. It was the first undeniable proof of the Nazi death system, and the name Erich Muhsfeldt appeared again and again in the records they found. But Muhsfeldt was already gone. 2 months before the liberation, he had been transferred back to Auschwitz-Birkenau, promoted to oversee crematorium operations during the mass extermination of Hungarian Jews. In that final year, Auschwitz had become a storm, a factory running at the speed of collapse. Trains arrived day and night. Entire families vanished into smoke within hours of arrival. Muhsfeldt, now a veteran of organized killing, worked with mechanical calm. He gave orders, signed forms, drank coffee, and watched the flames. To him, it was just another day of duty in a world falling apart. But even the most obedient cogs feel the tremor when the machine begins to fail. By autumn, rumors spread that the Allies were closing in, that the Führer's dream was ending. Some guards began to desert. Others destroyed documents, hoping their names would vanish with the smoke. Muhsfeldt stayed not out of loyalty, but because he had nowhere else to go. In January 1945, as the Red Army approached Auschwitz, the SS evacuated the camp. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced on death marches through the freezing Polish winter. Those who collapsed were shot where they fell. Those who survived walked until their feet bled through their shoes. Among the guards driving them forward was Erich Muhsfeldt. Witnesses would later recall seeing him during these marches, pistol in hand, face expressionless, shooting the weak without hesitation. He had become what the system had made him, a man incapable of mercy, even as the world around him dissolved. When the Nazis could no longer hide behind barbed wire, they hid behind uniforms. They told themselves they were soldiers again, not murderers. And so, as the camps fell, Muhsfeldt was reassigned to Flossenbürg concentration camp, tucked deep in Bavaria near the Czech border. By then, he was no longer the overseer of a vast crematorium, just another officer trying to survive the end. But even in its death throes, the regime demanded blood. At Flossenbürg, Muhsfeldt continued to enforce brutal discipline. He oversaw roll calls that lasted hours in freezing wind, executions without trial, and daily beatings. When the camp began to evacuate in April 1945, he joined the column of guards marching prisoners south, another death march, another trail of corpses left on the roadside. A survivor later said, "He looked thinner, paler, but his eyes were the same, empty, as if they had forgotten what they once were." By the end of April, the Reich had less than a week left to live. Berlin was burning. Hitler had sealed himself inside a bunker, and Muhsfeldt, once a proud SS officer, was nothing more than a fugitive, wandering through the wreckage of the world he helped build. He could have escaped, hidden under a false name, like so many others did. But fate, or perhaps something resembling justice, had other plans. When American troops liberated Flossenbürg on April 23, 1945, they found him wounded and delirious, hiding among the remnants of his own victims. The war ended 2 weeks later. Germany surrendered. The camps stood silent, and for the first time in years the ovens were cold. Muhsfeldt was arrested by Allied forces and placed in a military prison. He told his interrogators the same thing every Nazi officer said: "I was only following orders." But the world was no longer willing to accept that answer. The age of silence was over. A quiet truth lingers here. When a system built on lies collapses, its servants are left naked, stripped of uniforms, titles, excuses. And in that nakedness, the truth of who they really were finally emerges. For Muhsfeldt, that truth was unforgiving. He was no longer the efficient officer, no longer the man of order and control. He was just a murderer, waiting for judgment. In the months that followed, the Allies began to rebuild a sense of justice from the ashes of war. Military courts were established. Trials began. The world was ready to confront the men behind the machinery. And so, in the winter of 1947, in a courtroom in Kraków, Poland, Erich Muhsfeldt would once again hear his name, not shouted in salute, but read from a list of the condemned. Because even in the ruins of an empire, justice still remembers. Winter, 1947. Poland was frozen in silence, a silence different from wartime, but heavy all the same. In a courthouse in Kraków, the walls still carried the scars of occupation. Bullet holes patched with plaster, windows fogged by the breath of history. Inside, the Supreme National Tribunal prepared to deliver justice, not vengeance, but something far deeper: recognition. The defendant stood among other former SS men from Auschwitz and Majdanek. His name, Erich Muhsfeldt. Age, 34. Occupation, former camp official. He looked smaller now, thinner, pale, his once polished boots scuffed, his hands trembling as he tried to keep them still. The courtroom was full survivors, journalists, foreign observers, and the Polish citizens who had lived in the shadow of the camps. Some wept quietly, others sat in stony silence. No one applauded, no one shouted. Justice here did not need noise. When the proceedings began, Muhsfeldt listened as translators read witness testimonies one after another, each like a hammer striking the same truth. A Jewish survivor from Lublin described the trenches of November 1943. A Polish prisoner spoke of beatings, hangings, the smell of burning bodies. A woman recalled the face of her sister as Muhsfeldt ordered her to the furnace. The words were simple. They didn't dramatize. They didn't accuse. They just told what had happened. And that was enough. When it was his turn to speak, Muhsfeldt repeated the same refrain that echoed in courtrooms across Europe. I only followed orders. He claimed he had no choice, that disobedience meant death. He said he was just one man in a machine too large to stop. He said he never killed anyone with his own hands, though the witnesses, and history itself, said otherwise. The prosecutor, a man who had lost his entire family at Majdanek, answered calmly, "You did not have to pull the trigger to kill. You only had to keep the ovens warm." There was no shouting, no anger, just the unbearable quiet of truth laid bare. During the month-long trial, Muhsfeldt showed little remorse. He denied direct participation in certain killings, but admitted enforcing discipline. He blamed his superiors. He blamed the times. He blamed the war. But the faces in the courtroom, gaunt, hollowed, yet unbroken, reminded everyone that this was not a story about politics or orders. It was about choice. Because even in the machinery of genocide, there were always moments to choose, to refuse, to walk away. He never did. On December 22nd, 1947, the verdict was delivered. Guilty of crimes against humanity, mass murder, and participation in the extermination of civilians. The sentence, death by hanging. It was read in a calm voice, without triumph. The judges didn't smile. The survivors didn't cheer. Justice here was not about satisfaction. It was about balance, an attempt, however imperfect, to realign the moral axis of a world that had spun off course. The execution took place 1 month later, January 24th, 1948, inside Krakow's Montelupik prison. The chosen method was symbolic, deliberate. No gallows. No drop. Just a rope and a wall hook, the same way Muhsfeldt had once killed prisoners at Majdanek. He was brought in quietly. No priest. No farewell. When asked for his final words, he said none. Perhaps there was nothing left to say. A guard placed the rope around his neck, secured it to the hook, and kicked away the stool. It took several minutes. No one looked away. When it was over, the doctor nodded. The record simply read, "Execution completed at 6:14 a.m. His body was later sent to the Jagiellonian University, where medical students used it for anatomical study, a final, silent irony. The man who had turned human beings into waste became, in death, an anonymous specimen. His wife had died in an Allied bombing raid. His son had vanished on the Eastern Front, never heard from again. There was no one left to claim his remains. No flowers, no prayers, no name on a grave. Only the memory of what he had done preserved in testimony, in archives, and in the unspoken grief of those who survived. The lesson of Krakow was not about revenge, it was about truth. The world had learned that justice can be slow, imperfect, even painful, but it must exist, or humanity itself begins to disappear. In those post-war years, amid rubble and ruin, the idea of crimes against humanity was still new. It was born from trials like this one, from names like Muhsfeldt's, to remind future generations that the law must protect not power, but people. And yet, as the decades passed, the world began to forget. Majdanek faded into history books, overshadowed by bigger names, bigger battles. The photographs yellowed, the testimonies grew faint, and soon, the story of the baker who became a butcher was known only to those who still cared to remember. But remembrance is more than memory, it's responsibility. And that's where our story now turns. To the generations that came after, to the people who never lived through war but must carry its lessons still. Because forgetting is the first step to repetition. When the war ended in 1945, the world promised it would never forget. But promises fade faster than memories. At first, the images from Majdanek, Auschwitz, and Buchenwald filled newspapers across the globe. American soldiers who helped liberate the camps wrote home about what they had seen: piles of bodies, living skeletons, the smell of death that no wind could carry away. Some wept. Others took photographs, not because they wanted to, but because they needed proof. Proof that this nightmare was real. But back home, across the ocean, disbelief came quickly. How could this happen? People asked. Surely the numbers are exaggerated. Surely no civilized nation could build factories to burn human beings. It's painful to admit now, but for a time, even in America, some didn't believe. Not because they were cruel, but because the truth was too monstrous to comprehend. In the early post-war years, as Europe rebuilt, attention shifted. The Cold War began. Germany became an ally against a new enemy, the Soviet Union. And in that political shift, the horrors of the camps began to blur into the background. The men who had designed the machinery of death were gone, tried, executed, or vanished. And for many Americans, the Holocaust became a chapter in someone else's history far away, long ago. But history has a quiet way of returning when it's ignored. In the 1950 seconds, American soldiers stationed in Germany began visiting the ruins of the camps that they had once liberated. What they found disturbed them, not just the remnants of gas chambers, but the silence surrounding them. Local townspeople walked past without speaking. Children played near abandoned watchtowers. The world, it seemed, was ready to move on. Yet, as survivors began to emigrate to the United States, the silence started to break. In New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, Jewish refugees told their stories quietly, painfully, often to people who didn't know how to respond. One survivor said, "When I came to America, I thought I left the camp behind. But the camp never left me." Slowly, Americans began to listen. Documentaries were made. Schools started teaching the word Holocaust. Presidents visited memorials and spoke the phrase that would echo through generations. Never again. But never again is more than a slogan. It's a responsibility one that doesn't end with remembering the victims, but with recognizing the warning signs when they return. Because history doesn't always repeat itself in the same uniform or under the same flag. It repeats in whispers, in prejudice, in dehumanization, in the moments when we decide that some lives matter less than others. For Americans, the legacy of men like Erich Muhsfeldt is not just about Europe's past, it's about humanity's future. It's about understanding how ordinary people, in any nation, can be drawn into extraordinary evil when fear, nationalism, or obedience replace empathy. When we see hate groups rise again, when conspiracy replaces truth, when cruelty hides behind bureaucracy, those are the echoes of Majdanek. That's when remembrance becomes a weapon of resistance. In 1979, decades after Muhsfeldt's execution, a group of American veterans returned to Poland. They visited Majdanek, now preserved as a museum. The crematorium still stood blackened, silent. One of the veterans, now grey-haired, placed his hand on the cold brick and said, "I thought the war ended. But this place reminds me it never really does. It just waits for us to forget." Those words could have come from any of us, because forgetting is easier. Forgetting means not having to feel the weight of what people can do to each other. But forgetting also opens the same door that history once walked through. That's why this story of a baker turned butcher, of a camp turned tomb, of a world turned cold must keep being told. Not to sensationalize, not to terrify, but to humanize. To remind us that every number once had a name, every victim once had a heartbeat, and every man like Erich Muhsfeldt once had a choice. Here's the truth we must hold on to. Justice can punish the guilty, but only memory can protect the living. And as long as there are voices willing to tell these stories in classrooms, on screens, in whispered conversations between generations, then perhaps, in some small way, those who died at Majdanek have not been erased after all. The ovens of Europe are cold now, but the fire of remembrance must stay warm, because when we stop remembering, the earth begins to scream again. And in our final chapter, we'll reflect not on death, but on life, on resilience, and on the strength of remembering what must never be repeated. When the gates of Majdanek were opened in 1944, the world looked into an abyss, and for a moment, that abyss stared back, showing us everything we are capable of, both the monstrous and the miraculous. We saw how human hands could build factories of death. But we also saw how other hands, soldiers, survivors, Ordinary men and women could lift the world out of the ashes. In the years that followed, nations rebuilt cities, wrote laws, created memorials. But no monument, no courtroom, no verdict could truly measure the cost. 6 million Jews, millions of others, Poles, Roma, prisoners of war, political dissidents, the disabled, the forgotten, each one a heartbeat, a story, a universe, and among the ashes of their lives stood the reminder that evil is not an alien force. It is human. It begins with words, with silence, with small decisions that seem harmless at first until one day they aren't. Today, the ruins of Majdanek still stand. Visitors walk quietly among the barracks, past rusted barbed wire and silent watchtowers. The crematorium has been preserved, blackened by fire, hollow and still, and inside a massive concrete dome nearby lies a single mound of grey dust, ashes collected from the campgrounds after liberation. Mixed within them are the remains of tens of thousands of men, women, and children. Above the mound, carved in stone, are just 4 words. Let our fate be a warning. Every year, people from around the world come to read those words. Students, veterans, families, strangers who will never know the names of those they mourn. They stand in silence. And for a few moments, the world becomes still again. It's easy, in our age of screens and headlines, to think of history as something distant, something already settled. But memory doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to the living. Because every time someone says, "It wasn't that bad," or "That was long ago," or "It could never happen again," the echo of those words travels backward through time, to the trenches of Majdanek, to the smoke of Auschwitz, to the silence that let it all happen. Remembrance is not about guilt. It's about responsibility. It asks us not to hate, but to notice when people are being dehumanized, when cruelty becomes policy, when apathy becomes easier than action. It asks us to remember that Erich Muhsfeldt wasn't born a monster. He was made one by fear, by obedience, by the belief that following orders was safer than asking questions. And if evil can be taught, then so can compassion. If hatred can be organized, then so can courage. Somewhere in Poland, a wildflower grows between the cracks of an old crematorium floor. No one planted it. It found a way, a small act of defiance against a place built to erase life. That flower, fragile and silent, is the truest monument we have, because it reminds us that even in the darkest soil, life still insists on blooming. The human cost of forgetting is not measured in numbers, it's measured in the lessons we fail to learn. When prejudice finds a new voice, when truth becomes optional, when empathy is dismissed as weakness, that's when the ghosts of the past begin to whisper again. But we have the power to answer them. By teaching, by listening, by refusing to let the world grow numb. Every story told, every name remembered, every lesson carried forward, is an act of resistance against oblivion. And that, in the end, is what this story is really about. Not Erich Muhsfeldt, not even Majdanek, but us, the people left behind, holding history in our hands, deciding what to do with it, to look away or to look closer, to forget or to remember. Because remembrance is not about the past. It's about protecting our future. If this story moved you, share it not for views, not for numbers, but because every share keeps one more voice alive. Every click, every conversation, is a small promise that what happened once will never happen again, so that when the world grows loud with hate and the earth begins to tremble, we can answer, with the strength of memory, and whisper back, "Not this time,